All right, greetings everybody. We're about to get started again, so if I can ask people just to finish up your conversations, grab your last refreshments, take your seats and quiet down. We are going to move into our third panel, and I'm happy to turn it over to the panel moderator, David Sanger, the national security correspondent for the New York Times, who will introduce our next speaker. Thank you very much.
Very well. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times and the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs here at Harvard, where I teach national security when I'm not doing my day job. But it's a great pleasure to be here with Sheila Coronel. When Sheila and I first met, I won't say how many years ago, because I'm sure she was a small child at the time. She was keeping me alive during various coup attempts against Cory Aquino, when I would fly into the Philippines and we were covering these. But in addition to her work for the New York Times, which was brilliant and great, she also went on to really get going the Philippine investigative journalism tradition, and she at the time was handling, I want to make sure I get this name right, she was the founder of the Philippine Center for Investigative Journalism, and she's now the academic dean at the Columbia School of Journalism, one of the great journalism schools in America, and director of the Stigler Center for Investigative Journalism. And so it's great fun to be back here with Sheila. We could just tell you stories back and forth from the coup attempts, but we'll go on to something a bit more serious. What we want to do is talk a little bit about the rise of a great populist in President Estrada and what happened as investigative journalism began to eat away a bit at his reputation and understand the pacing of that. And that sort of starts the story in the middle. So we're going to back up a little bit at some point to what we learned from the Marcos presidency, which sort of set the stage for this. And now what we have learned from watching President Duterte and his interesting and odd relationship with President Trump. So that's where we're going to take it. So Sheila, let me just start by asking you, for those who don't remember the history here or were focused on something else at the time, tell us a little bit about who Estrada was and his sort of improbable rise. Because when I was in and out of the Philippines in the Marcos era, he was really a fringe character who you saw mostly in bizarre entertainment roles on TV. Obviously something that could never happen here. So, yes. Pick it up there.
Right. So Joseph Estrada was the first president probably anywhere in the world who took his oath of office not using his real name but his screen name. So he was a movie actor for a long time. He became famous starting in the 60s, playing this sort of James Dean type of roles, this very roguish gangster, but gangster with a heart for the poor type roles. And he parlayed that into political career after the fall of Marcos when we had popular elections. He was also mayor of a small town for a long time. But he parlayed his movie history, his movie background, his celebrity status, international political office when he ran for the Senate in the Philippines. And so he was a senator. He mostly slept through the Senate deliberations. He was...
That happens here a fair bit.
He passed one bill, which was a bill on protecting the water buffalo. So he was sort of a lightweight character, really not taken seriously by mainstream Filipino politicians. He didn't have a political party, but he did have, a celebrity status. And so when there was an uprising against Marcos, there was Cory Aquino, followed by Fidel Ramos. Estrada started making overtures about being president, but even then nobody took him seriously because he didn't seem to be taking himself seriously anyway. Yeah.
Well, this sort of reminds me, because you think about his start, and you think about our reaction when President Trump, as candidate Trump, first came down the big escalator in Trump Tower, and everybody was saying, this guy's been on reality TV and done real estate. I think I told my family he'd be out of the race in about 2 or 3 months. And within a year, I was doing the Times' foreign policy interviews with him. So that tells you how wrong I was. But part of this was that he was able to use, as Trump was, his popularity among the celebrity press, which, if you have not seen it in the Philippines, is a remarkable creature in and of itself, to sort of bootstrap this at a moment that nobody in the mainstream press thought that he was remotely credible.
That's right. I mean, he was a celebrity, very popular with the celebrity press, very popular with the new type of TV programs, TV news programs that gained popularity. Once the press was free, once the media was free, you had these very sensational, very entertainment-oriented TV programs that were also called news programs. And so Estrada made an appearance there. He was funny. He was a joker. He made the charming and really disarming thing about Estrada was that he made fun of himself. He said, I'm a womanizer, I have 5 mistresses, I'm a gambler, I'm a smoker, I have all the vices. But he made himself believable and credible to people in that way. It was like saying to all of these Filipino men, especially, I'm just like you. How many of you have not cheated on your wives? How many of you don't gamble? How many of you don't drink? So he made his own foibles seem normal and natural and a reflection. And I think we saw this in both Berlusconi and Trump, and a reflection of the people's own fallibilities as well. I hang out with fallible friends. I have fallible relatives, like all of you. So, when he started making all his mistakes in office, he made them seem natural and only a reflection of his own people's flaws. Yeah.
It is interesting, because we did see that in Trump later on in his radio interviews as he was building up to this. I wouldn't say he necessarily had the same sense of humor about himself that Estrada did,
Yeah.
but that was the case. So he manages to turn the celebrity press element of this to begin to deliver this very populist, very simplistic message about where he would take the Philippine economy, where he'd take the Philippine people.
Right. I think he very easily melded his political persona on his movie star persona, meaning the role that he played in movies. Defender of the poor, roguish, but really well-meaning and compassionate. And so he did play on that. As he said, when he won as president, he said, the presidency is the greatest performance of my life. There was really no distinction between his role in the movies and what he saw himself as a politician. It's a role, it's a script, and this is what people know me as, and this is what I am in public. So there was no dissonance in his mind and in many of the people's minds that the role he played in movies was very different from what he was in his personal life, which was decadent and all that, but because people expected that of movie stars.
Now, in the United States, as we wrote about him, because we have that wonderful journalistic capability to look back and not forward, we were comparing him to Ronald Reagan. Movie star,
right?
Light on substance, although by comparison, Reagan was pretty heavy on substance compared to Estrada. Reagan ran through a fair number of wives as well, and relationships in between.
But not simultaneously.
He didn't do them simultaneously, that's true. Estrada had him beat there. But we were using this comparison. And now as we look back at it, though, it wasn't really very apt, because Estrada understood something about making the use of not only the celebrity media, but then as he moved on into the mainstream, where he was concerned that his treatment would not be anywhere near as friendly, my recollection is he began to buy off publishers, buy off reporters. You know, he mixed the celebrity part with that fabulous Philippine tradition of corruption between politicians and the media.
Right. Well, Estrada was used to fawning celebrity press. The celebrity press in most countries is rarely critical, right? They really write about, you know, as they say, you know, in the celebrity press, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Everything is good publicity. So even if the celebrity press has been putting up about the affairs in movie stars, etc., they sort of normalized it and made it part of, you know, this is what he is. He's not hypocritical. He's true to what he is. So what happened with Estrada was when he then became president, because the political press didn't really pay him much attention, and he was senator because he was a lightweight senator. When he became president and then became the subject of the political press, and which tends to be in the Philippines quite critical, he really was surprised. You know, he was not used to being criticized. And when that happened...
What does this remind you of?
And because celebrities really are not used to being criticized. They're used to being adored. And Estrada was used to public adulation. And so when that happened, he really he did several things. One, he asked his movie friends to withhold advertising, so all the movie advertising from the newspapers that were critical of him. He expanded that to his businessmen cronies and all the big businessmen who wanted to please the president. He said, don't advertise in the Inquirer and all these critical papers. And then he had his friends take over the independent newspapers, as in they bought out, and it happened during Thaksin's time as well. He had his cronies take over some of the more critical newspapers. And he definitely, with television, you know, he started, you know, TV networks have to get franchises from government, so he knew how to apply pressure on media proprietors and thereby have, you know, very friendly, uncritical reporting in the mainstream media.
I think Americans, because of our First Amendment tradition, which is, you know, so unusual even in the Western world, don't tend to understand this as much. And so the pattern that you just described with Estrada is certainly what we later saw in Putin's Russia, right? Buy out the independent media if you can, close it if you can't buy it, right? Certainly seen that in China in the past 5 years, less buying than just plain old closing. We saw a good deal of that in South Korea when the military leadership was still there. And it's what makes you nervous about the concentration of media ownership, even here in the United States. So were there any big lessons that we can draw from what the reaction was in the Philippines as he began this press crackdown?
Well, the reaction initially of the mainstream press was to keep quiet and be cautious. The lessons there is that, you know, you need small, independent newspapers. You know, we ran a nonprofit, investigative reporting nonprofit. You need alternative media to be channels for information which does not come out in the mainstream. Estrada was very successful in establishing control over the information flows, you know, up to 2 years into his presidency. It was really just in the last 6 months when there was criticism coming out. There was also the fact that he was immensely popular, and journalists are always wary about being critical of a popular president because they cater to a public. And a public that adores the president, is very hard to make that public buy or read or watch critical reporting. So that was a major consideration as well. Remember, Estrada got TV ratings. Everything he said, no matter how stupid, got TV ratings. And so television networks featured him because he was telegenic. He knew how to play up to the TV camera. His one-liners were such put-downs. You know, when the Archbishop of Manila criticized him for having so many wives, all he said was, "Cardinal, you seem to be more worried about this than my wives are. Right? My wives are not complaining. Why are you complaining?"
Did the Cardinal have an answer to that? So tell me a little bit about the turn. So about a year, he was riding high on this. And, you know, the more we talk about it, the more the comparisons with last year and the amount of TV time that went to, you know, one-liners and zingers. And, you know, we're still captivated by, I think, of the NFL comments last night, right? And so about a year into this, something happened to the mainstream press in the Philippines where they began to actually report more actively on the conflicts of interest, the buying out of independent press, the silencing of enemies. What led to the turn?
Well, the turn really came around 2 years into his presidency. What led to the turn was that the scandals were coming out to the fore, in part because his coalition started cracking. And you know, and again, this is where the similarity, because Estrada hung out with a lot of, shall we say, sleazy, dodgy business types, you know, verging on mobsters and people with really dodgy businesses. And so he tried to please them all, and inevitably there would be conflict within this bunch of dodgy individuals, and one of them felt that he was... So this is the thing. Estrada was getting cuts from illegal gambling. Illegal gambling is one of the biggest sources of political financing in the Philippines, but it tends to be very local. This is the first time, at least that we know of, that it was shown that the president was actually getting 3% of the revenues from illegal gambling, and that the money was being delivered to him every month by one of his cronies. And that crony felt left out of another gambling deal, and so he blew the whistle. And he went out and said, every month I would bring, it was a lot of million of pesos. I think it was about 5 million pesos a month, which was about I don't know how much that is in dollars. Anyway, he would bring this amount of money in black attaché cases, bring them to the presidential palace. And that revelation by a whistleblower from the inside really shocked people and emboldened the media to do much more critical reporting, something they didn't do in the past when Estrada was very popular and basically had, you know, was putting pressure on them. But now that some of this was coming out, they couldn't ignore this. This was a big story. The fact that the president was, as this whistleblower said, the lord of all gambling lords, was a story that could not be ignored. Yeah.
So it was really the discovery of the suitcases full of cash.
Yeah.
He would not be the first politician to have been brought down by, you know, similar discovery. But that put some spine in the mainstream newspapers,
Right.
which begins to make you think that the entire tradition of strong journalism hadn't been entirely destroyed in the Philippines. It was just sort of in abeyance.
Yeah, I think there is a community of journalists in the Philippines who really believe that it's their duty to hold the power to account. And and certainly they were scared and intimidated, but when the story started coming out, there was no stopping it. Initially, when my center started doing an investigation on Estrada's corruption, focusing on the houses that he built for his multiple mistresses, no one wanted to use our story. So we're a nonprofit. We depended on the publication of our stories in mainstream media. When we first started coming out with questions about where Estrada got his wealth and the mansions and other acquisitions for his mistresses, no one wanted to use them. But after the whistleblower came out in public, the lid was off. You know, everybody wanted a piece of the story, and we began collaborating with TV networks, with newspapers. We couldn't produce enough scandal to feed for, you know, to satisfy the feeding frenzy on the president. Yeah.
It's amazing how quickly these things turn. But let's go back to one sentence you just had there, which was your investigative reporting center, as I recall it from my visits later on, didn't rely on advertising.
Yeah.
didn't rely on any corporate money. You were basically putting this together on a shoestring. And your only payments came from payments from the newspapers that picked things up because you were doing the kind of reporting that their staff should have been doing but wasn't.
Correct. Yeah, we were basically like a lot of the nonprofit investigative reporting centers here, getting some money from foundations. We got some money from the sales of stories to newspapers and TV stations. But yes, we had no advertisers. They couldn't squeeze us. Nobody could take over us because nobody would like to buy us. I mean, we're not
You
profitable.
weren't worth taking over.
we weren't worth taking over. What's the point? And we had no newspaper, no TV station to take over. So we were basically just a group of mainly women journalists in some little office in Quezon City. And so we had no assets that were of use to anybody. Yeah.
So this is an interesting model because as people think here and in Europe and elsewhere in Asia about what the nonprofit models look like for journalism, we've got a couple. ProPublica. My former boss, Bill Keller, is running the Marshall Project, which mostly focuses on issues of criminal justice, and particularly incarceration and so forth. There are a couple of other models. How's that look elsewhere around the world? How many more models like what you were doing in the Philippines have you seen?
Well, this is really a golden moment for nonprofit investigative reporting. Actually, in the U.S., there are nearly 100 of them. Some of them very local, some of them attached to public radio stations, some of them very issue-focused, like the Marshall Project. There are, I think, over 100 other nonprofit investigative reporting centers all around the world. There's a very vibrant movement of nonprofit investigative journalism. Every other year, all of us gather together someplace around the world with the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. And there really is a community of muckrakers that are helping each other out and creating a network that is very strong and very supportive. So whenever someone is imprisoned, this network comes into action.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned that some of these are very local. And slightly different than the Philippines. That's all the more vital here in the United States, just as we try to draw some of the lessons from this, because while the economics of journalism have allowed some big, concentrated, powerful news organizations, the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, less so the LA Times, among them to survive, the casualties have been very local. A lot of local newspapers have just plain old closed. And so if you don't have one of these nonprofit news organization groups, you know, the story about the corrupt sewer commissioner is never going to happen.
Exactly, yeah.
Because the large organizations aren't going to cover it, right? Well, let's get back for a moment to Estrada and take us to the end of the story here before we go talk about both Marcos and the current Philippine government. How did this all play out?
So Estrada was, Estrada, I think, was blindsided by the sudden drop in his popularity and the mobilization of protest by what we in the Philippines call the People Power constituency. These were basically the sections of the society that were mobilized against Marcos in 1986, led by the Catholic Church, led by Cardinal Sin, whom, if those of you who are old enough to remember, it was Cardinal Sin's call for people power that ended the Marcos regime in 1986, who went on Catholic radio station, by the business community in Manila, by the middle class. It was really an urban, Manila-based uprising comprised mainly of middle-class sections of the population and led by the Catholic Church and the business community. So this was the People Power constituency. That constituency got Cory Aquino into power, and that constituency got Estrada out of power, in part because Estrada rankled the Catholic sensibilities. This is also a very Catholic constituency. And because Estrada really, you can say, as in Thailand, that these are the liberal elites that brought about the fall of Marcos. So Estrada was against those liberal elites. He saw himself as an outsider, even if he came from a Jesuit school, an upper middle class family. He dropped out of school and saw himself as uncouth, unsophisticated. His English was not good, and he identified with the masses because of that. Basically, it was the middle class and the elites taking over again, ousting a populist regime and re-establishing liberal elite political democracy in the Philippines. Yeah.
So let's look for a minute at the question of where that came from. So in the Marcos era, you had a US-backed dictator who knew how to do the dramatic flair, and certainly his wife knew how to do the dramatic flair.
Yes.
And so, they had both iron control of the country, but this sort of celebrity status that the U.S. in some ways helped encourage. I mean, think about the incredible state visit that Reagan put on for the Aquinos, for the Marcoses,
or George Bush toasting Marcos and saying, "We love your adherence to democracy."
Yes.
Yeah. At a time when people were being killed in the Philippines.
That's right. That was a great video to go rerun in the midst of the People Power revolution. People Power happens. Benigno Aquino comes back to the Philippines after being...
No, Cory Aquino. Benigno was shot. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Benigno, no, I meant Benigno comes back on the plane.
Right.
After being here at Harvard for 2 or 3 years when I was an undergraduate. That's where I first got to know him. He gets back on as the one who was going to basically take over, is assassinated minutes after the plane lands. And his wife, Cory Aquino, suddenly is cast into this role that she could never really have imagined herself in. But she had much more the air of those elites you were talking about.
She certainly had not just the heir, but she is the heir to a 6,000-hectare sugar plantation.
Right.
She comes from landed gentry, and so did Ninoy Aquino. Ninoy Aquino was fourth-generation member of Congress in his family. His great-great-grandfather was a member of the 1898 Congress that took over the Philippines. So they were really, literally had silver spoons and literally to the manor born. So they were really as elite as you could get. Yeah.
And when you'd go talk to her, and I remember going to visit her in the presidential palace when I would go in and out of the Philippines as a correspondent, she oozed a sort of elitist kind of air. And while she could be a pretty interesting interview, you always walked out of it saying, how does this sell in the rest of the country? So to some degree, I think you could argue that Estrada's rise was a reaction to how they felt about her.
Well, I think about her and what she represented. So Cory Aquino's charisma, if you can call it that, came from the fact that she was the widow of Ninoy Aquino. And I was there when she was going around the country and saying, and this is how, I am like you, I am a victim of Marcos. And you could see people crying because she identified with that victimization. She would say, I am only the most prominent victim, but I am like you. So she did have that charisma. She did have that connection with the people, even if the truth is that she was not like most Filipinos, right?
And they knew it.
And they knew it. But she cast herself as being a victim like them. And so for her, that was how she was brought into the wings. It was, on People Power, made her president. But the system of government that she brought on after the fall of Marcos was really a recreation of the old feudal land-owning, not so much land-owning anymore, but the old elite coming to power. The Congress that was instituted was based on political districts that were controlled by powerful families at the local level. So she brought it back. Democracy in the Philippines after Marcos was really a reinstitution of old feudal political and patronage structures. Basically, she brought all of these families back into political power. And Estrada came 12 years after that restoration, where the gloss of democratic politics had sort of, with the what do you call it? I still remember, after 86, being a journalist, the ability to write so freely without fear of censorship or prison, that was so exhilarating. So the immediate, after the fall of Marcos, everything seemed new, exhilarating, that you could speak and write so freely. People love that. But 12 years after, all of that exhilaration had dissipated already, and people are looking at their lives and saying, 12 years of democracy, what has it really brought us? We're still the same. We're still poor. Nothing much has changed.
And she looked pretty weak along the way. I mean, those moments when you were trying to keep me out of sniper fire as I was walking stupidly down the sidewalks in Makati during the coup attempts were a reflection of the fact that you had a military that saw her as a fairly easy target.
Right. Partly because she was a woman. Right? There's never been a commander-in-chief of the Philippines who was a woman, and you had these very macho coup leaders. One of them, Gringo Hanasan, has a mustache. And have you ever seen a military officer with a mustache and long hair? And he used to parachute out of a helicopter with a snake named Tiffany in his pocket. So how could you? I mean, that was the sort of machismo that they sort of exhibited. And here was this woman in a yellow dress and eyeglass, and she really looked weak in comparison to them. So they took advantage of that weakness. It was it was machismo returning to Philippine politics, I think, at that moment, and tried to oust her 7 times. I mean, they tried 7 times to mount a coup.
And she couldn't throw him in jail.
Yeah, and the last time she nearly fell, were it not for American fighter planes that flew over the military bases to give cover to the pro-Aquino forces, thereby defeating the coup plotters. Yeah.
For those of you who may not remember that event, this was Dan Quayle's one moment as commander-in-chief. George H.W. Bush was in the hospital having some kind of operation that required him to be under an anesthetic, and he had transferred power to Dan Quayle. One of the more terrifying moments in American history. And this set of events happened, and it was Quayle who had to go order and it turned out, it worked out fine.
It worked out fine.
And had he not done it, she probably
would have fallen.
She probably would have fallen. And the colonel who was trying to do these overthrows, I didn't mind him. I kind of was amused by the helicopter stuff. But the one time we got to interview him, he brought Tiffany to the interview, which I found a little disconcerting. So anyway, okay. So that takes us back and gives us a little bit of a sense of what they were reacting against. Now take us up to the current moment.
The current moment, yes. So the Philippines has a history of having populist strongmen. Marcos was one such person. Estrada was populist, but he was less of a strongman. He was more of like a
showman.
Showman, yeah. And now we have Rodrigo Duterte, who is a mayor, just as Estrada was. Duterte was mayor of Davao, which is the 3rd largest city in the Philippines, in Mindanao. Again, the same appeal. He cast himself as an outsider, one, because he's from Mindanao, which is the southernmost island in the country, and he is the first president from Mindanao. No other president from Mindanao. No, in our 100-year history, or more than 100 years as a as having electoral politics, we haven't had a head of state from Mindanao. Second, he speaks with a thick Visayan accent, and so he cast himself really more as an outsider, didn't have the polish of Cory Aquino, for example, who was educated here in the U.S., and he said he was anti-elite, even if he was the son of a governor. He managed very much like Trump or Thaksin to project himself as against the elite, and he mocked the elite for everything that they had not done. He succeeded Benigno Aquino III, Cory Aquino's son, who was president, and showed him as weak, elitist, all his liberal language, respect for human rights. Where did that get you? You have this is basically Duterte's message. Where did that get you? You have a country now that is in thrall of drug addiction, criminality is rampant, et cetera, et cetera. And Duterte has systematically tried to dismantle all the democratic institutions that had been set in place in 1986. His latest move was to his Congress tried to give the Commission on Human Rights a budget of 1,000 pesos, which is like $20, right? And he's mocked the Supreme Court. He's mocked all the democratic checks and balances that have been put in there to rein in the abuse of power. Not that these institutions have managed to rein in abuse of power. They haven't, but the little that there is, he's tried to neutralize and tried to make fun of and mock. So he's basically made a mockery of democracy, the democratic process, and has basically said, I'm going to kill all the drug addicts, and there's nothing wrong with that.
And along the way of killing all the drug addicts, he's killed a lot of people or has resulted in the deaths of a lot of people who were simply on the wrong end of some grudge and may or may not have had any drug history as well.
Well, we don't know. I mean, we don't even know how many people have been killed. We know there have been at least thousands. Maybe it's 9,000, maybe it's 10,000, maybe more. Many of those were suspected to be drug dealers, but a lot of them included children who were caught in the crossfire, or children mistaken to be drug addicts, or they could have been enemies of policemen or just about anyone. There have been so many killings, it's hard to keep track and to investigate each one.
We'll get back to the investigation part in a moment, but I just want to use the moment to talk a little bit about the nature of American pressure on human rights issues. In the Marcos era, we were criticized, rightly so, for not standing up to what he was doing, and you mentioned the George H.W.
Except for a brief period during the Carter presidency.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. In the Trump era, the line we've gotten from Secretary Tillerson is, this is not the kind of conversation that is worthwhile having in public because people's backs will just get up. But don't worry, whenever we have private conversations with governments that are abusing human rights, we make this a significant issue. And then about 3 or 4 months ago, we got a leaked transcript, leaked from the Philippines, bless the Philippine Foreign Ministry, of a transcript of the conversation between President Duarte and President Trump. And rather than have him privately chastised for what he was doing, President Trump said something to the effect of, you're doing a phenomenal job with that drug problem. We have a lot of drug problems here as well. We would really benefit from what you've learned in doing this. And what's interesting is that the night this thing leaked out, I remember calling over to the National Security Council, and they basically confirmed that the transcript was accurate. I had them go back and pull the U.S. transcript to make sure somebody had not, somebody wasn't playing with us because the lines were so remarkable. So let's imagine an alternate universe in which the United States was up threatening the Philippines with a cutoff of aid or military support or whatever. Under these conditions, where it's pretty obvious to the Philippine people what's going on, would it make a difference?
I don't know. Duterte has, among his many enemies, include the United States and everything that he thinks the United States stands for, which is hypocrisy about democracy and human rights. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
which is why he spoke in such a kindly way about President Obama. Yeah.
Yes, and he likes to bring up the fact that the United States did colonize the Philippines in 1898.
It's a fact.
And did put 100,000 Filipinos in these hamlets, these strategic hamlets they had in Vietnam. A lot of those people died.
Yep.
And that the U.S. forces did fight a brutal pacification campaign in the Philippines, including against the Muslims in the Philippines. So,
Yep.
so he's bringing that all back. He's being very anti-American. So will U.S. pressure against on a president that says he's anti-American, will that work, or will that only help reinforce what he's saying, right, about the hypocrisy of the United States?
The hypocrisy argument is a very good one and can be used by a lot of countries against the Iranians use it all the time when they recall the coup that the United States organized in the 50s. But that gets to where we are on the Estrada spectrum, from early adulation to, as you point out, 2 years in, the beginning of the collapse. Where are we in that in the Duterte world?
We are in the adulation phase. Duterte, in the last poll, which was June, his popularity rating is 82%, slightly higher than when he was elected president a year ago. So he remains very popular, the killings notwithstanding, the anti-American rhetoric notwithstanding, his burial of Ferdinand. Ferdinand Marcos died in 1989, and he hadn't been buried until last year. He was sort of being pickled in a mausoleum in his home country. He's displayed like that, like Stalin and Mao were. A lot of wax and chemicals.
I was about to say, I hope they did a better job than they did with Mao. Yeah, okay.
So that's because his family refused to have him buried unless he's buried in the National Heroes Cemetery. And successive presidents have decided that he's not a hero, therefore should not be in the cemetery for heroes, except for Duterte, who allowed in the early morning, wee hours of the morning, for Marcos to be buried in the Heroes Cemetery. And so despite all of that, despite the antipathy against Marcos that still exists among a large number of Filipinos, he remains very, very popular. Yeah.
Well, let's conclude our part of the conversation with a little bit of a discussion of the lessons here for both the press and the social media, because what was missing in the Estrada era that we have, of course, in the Trump era is social media in all of its great glory, which is to say a direct communication form for the president to communicate with his people, a way to voice not only dissent back at the ruling party, but also to undercut traditional media and sort of grow in the divisiveness. I have a sense that had Estrada had Twitter, he probably would have lasted longer.
He probably would have. I think Estrada fell precipitously in part because the media were airing and publishing all these critical pieces against him, and also because his impeachment trial was on television live. And it was so obvious the way Estrada was trying to manipulate the results of the trial. So all of that, and when the trial ended, because basically all the prosecutors resigned and everybody resigned in protest against the senators who wanted to protect Estrada, people started massing up on EDSA, which is this highway where the 1986 uprising took place, and they just didn't leave there until Estrada had left public office. So the media there was basically, in a way, you can say it was a control of information. The mainstream media, televisions and newspapers, was a controlled space. No one else could get into that space unless you owned a TV network or a newspaper. Now it is no longer a controlled space. In fact, Duterte's success is to a great extent to be accounted for by his success using social media, by his ability to communicate directly with people, bypassing traditional media, and also by demonizing traditional media. So what Duterte has done actually is to demonize the institutions of democracy, dysfunctional as it was, the institutions of Philippine democracy, and that included the media, the Catholic Church. They were strong supporters of at least Cory Aquino and of the democratic movement against Marcos. The media, the Catholic Church, civil society, which is like in Italy and many places, also came into flowering with the restoration of democracy. He's managed to criticize all of them and demonize all of them so that there is now no single institution that is untainted or by his attacks. So they have lost, what he says, the high ground and the confidence that they used to have. Because Duterte has shown them to be ineffective, incompetent, hypocritical, and an obstacle to his agenda of bringing about law and order in the country.
Remarkable and amazing parallels. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, And I wanted to leave some time for all of you to be able to ask Sheila, because I've had the chance of having all the fun here. So we'll start right here with you.
So we've not talked. Okay, let me try to ask the question, maybe you repeat it for people who are streaming. We're not talking enough about the economic situation in the Philippines, and it's my ignorance, I don't know now. So I would like to know to what extent the Estrada success was a result of economic inequality, of people felt like we've heard in Thailand, we've heard in Italy, we've heard in the United States, of people whose needs don't get addressed. And to what extent Estrada or Duarte succeeded in addressing those needs, maybe sort of in an unorthodox way, but succeeded in addressing those needs?
Well, it's true. Estrada's political base was the poorest of the poor. And his movie star charisma appealed to them. But he wasn't in power long enough to do any long-lasting changes. He did have a number of left-wing populist officials in his government, including for housing, anti-poverty efforts. But once the government unraveled, they really were not able to do anything much. Duterte's appeal is actually not the poorest of the poor. It is actually a little bit different from Estrada's, because the poorest people in the last election voted for another movie star type, the daughter of a popular movie star. The ones who voted for Duterte were sort of people who were employed, were educated, but were feeling that they didn't have the opportunities to prosper under the current setup. They were people who, a lot of them, the quintessential example people use, they were workers in the call centers. These were the business processing. Business processing is one. This is the outsourcing. It's one of the biggest, fastest growing sectors of the Philippine economy. So you have all of these, if you pick up your phone for a credit card problem or because your printer or computer is not working, it's likely you're talking to someone from the Philippines or from India. And that's a fast growing sector of the economy. And a lot of them are college graduates, but most of them are stuck with, spending most of their nights, because there's 12-hour difference, servicing your printing or credit card problems. And there is no upward mobility. They're there, they actually get well paid by Philippine standards. Some of them get paid more than university professors, but they also see around them all of these new real estate developments, these fancy condominiums, these fancy cars, these fancy phones, to which they can only aspire for. And so this is this sector that Duterte has appealed to, not the poorest, but sort of the aspiring lower middle class who want to be able to consume some of the luxury goods and have some of the opportunities that the middle class, the middle class and the rich have, and which is also visible. There's much more visible consumerism in the Philippines than when I was growing up. I was growing up under the martial law era where, nobody drove new cars, everything was heavily taxed. There weren't all these fancy malls. And now you see all over Southeast Asia all these fancy malls, all this high-level consumption, which people can only aspire to. And so Duterte was speaking to that resentment. And these are also the people who are victims of petty crimes and are more, because they work at night, they have to go back to their, poor areas which have very little security. And so Duterte spoke to them. And also because Duterte didn't come from the elite universities, Duterte saw that, and he could say, I'm like you. I'm rejected by the elite because I have such a thick accent. I don't speak English so well. I've also, I can't get to what I aspire to because I didn't go to any of those universities. My parents don't have the same kind of connections to the urban Manila centers of power. So it's a different kind of of sector that Estrada appealed to. Yeah.
Right back here. Yeah.
So you discussed a little bit about like the muckraking journalism. How do you recommend? So it seems like no matter what press gets put out against Trump, it kind of seems to empower him a little bit more because he's able to deflect the issues to his own personal gain. So how do you recommend negotiating, especially just journalism in general, to be a muckraker without empowering the person you're trying to whistleblow? If that makes sense.
So you mean how to muckrake without demonizing the target of your investigation?
Empowering.
Without empowering.
Yeah.
Empowering him by... I think that's a question for you guys. You're the muckrakers in this country. I mean,
Well, first of all, we try not to use the phrase muckraking. It's got a certain wonderful air in American history, but it's 117 years ago. Well, the first thing I think you'd have to say is if you look at President Trump's popularity just in the polling, to the degree that polling is reliable, and last year's election would make you doubt that, it's been on a steady plummet. We haven't seen a new president at these levels in my lifetime. That is not entirely because of the journalism that has surrounded him. I think it has to do with sort of his underlying actions and his behavior, because even his supporters, when you go off and interview them, say, oh, God, if somebody would just, could Ivanka take away the phone, or, it has to do more with his behavior than with the substance of what he has done. But there is an essential truth to something here that my observation in years as a foreign correspondent would say was true in the Philippines and many other places that I've covered. And my time as a foreign correspondent was almost entirely in Asia. I was 6 years in Asia when Sheila was still in the Philippines. And that truth is that we're an elite press that's talking to a fairly small subsegment of the American population, and that while the spread of the New York Times online and everybody else's view online has widened what that is, it's astounding to me when I'm out in the middle of the country, facts that we sit here absorbed by that they haven't heard anything about, whether it's the Russia investigation or anything like that. So the tweets make their way through because they're 140 characters long and spicy. The journalism takes a long time to catch up. As I hear the remarkable Estrada story from Sheila, what it tells you is there is a tipping point where at some point, if the facts line up enough, that becomes the dominant narrative. We're not there with President Trump, and I'm not sure we ever will be there, because frankly, the people who support him despite what they see as his excesses. And I have no confidence that the Russia investigation is going to take us any place particularly close to the president himself on the underlying facts. In the fact that Mueller is off looking at obstruction of justice issues surrounding the firing of Comey tells you that there may ultimately be, it may involve the president in the effort to try to end the investigation, but not in the underlying facts. And so I'm not sure that the Trump story and the Estrada story are going to track.
no, I don't. Probably not.
Yeah.
Not from the looks of it. And also, really, as you said, it's the media situation has changed very much. It used to, with social media platforms becoming much more ubiquitous and other sources of information, YouTube, for example. It used to be that the networks controlled what you saw on television, not anymore. It used to be that New York Times and the Washington Post, set the news agenda. Not anymore.
Right. Now, there is a little bit of a backlash to this, and I'd be interested to see if this happened in the Philippines as well. We're certainly seeing it, which is 2 years ago, I think we certainly saw the fact that our audiences were atomized, meaning that people weren't really thinking about where they got their sources of information. In the world in which people throw around the phrase fake news, whether it's about real fake news, like what the Russians did, or fake news, which is what the president frequently talks about, things that are reported out, but you're just trying to denounce it, to try to discredit it. I think that there is a beginning of a retreat to credible sources of data, that people are beginning to ask the question, what was the underlying reporting that led to this? I don't know if that happened in the Philippines at some point or not, because it's a very different audience.
It's a very different audience, but I think once all the facts, the evidence of Estrada's multiple misdeeds started coming out, and there was an impeachment trial where witnesses actually said, one bank officer, the vice president of a bank, actually said she was 1 foot, and literally, this is the exact quote, I was 1 foot away from the president when he signed a bank account using a fake name. That was evidence that, nobody could really, Estrada was unable to mount a counter narrative. I mean, he couldn't defend it. He couldn't defend opening a bank account under his own name. He couldn't deny it, and he couldn't defend it. Yeah.
Okay, so there were a hand back there. Yeah.
Hi. How would you describe the effect of the spread of alternative facts and fake news under the current Philippine administration? One example I could think of is Assistant Secretary Mocha Uson's mistake in uploading a picture of the Vietnam War to signify the facts that would justify martial law in Mindanao right now. Thank you.
There has been a lot of that. There's been a plethora of fake news websites, and there's a sort of a pathway where the news, the real fake news, the really fake news.
You've lost me.
The truly fake news travels from the fake news websites through social media platforms, through blogs like that one from the assistant press secretary, and then into mainstream media, and then the president then coming out and declaring this to be the case. So you can almost, in many cases, you can almost trace that pathway. So there is really a link between fake news and the manufacture of information from the president's office, let's say. Yeah. They've been very, very effective because a lot of Filipinos are on Facebook. Most Filipinos. I've been all around the country. I'm surprised because, like in Indonesia, and I know about Thailand, you get Facebook for free on your phone. You don't have to pay for the data. Yeah. And most Filipinos get their news and updates from their friends, and they're on Facebook on such long hours. So yeah, I think Facebook is a main conduit for fake news in the Philippines.
This actually takes you to what we should do a separate conference on at some point, which is that Facebook, whether we like it or not, and you saw this in Zuckerberg's own statement yesterday or the day before on the Russia issues, has become a major news outlet, but one without editors until the past few months. And so now they're stuck between their old image of themselves as a pipe that does not in any way filter the news, to their intermediate stage, which is we'll take out beheading videos and child pornography, to where they're headed, which is they're actually going to have a fully edited news product.
Yeah, in my conversation with friends in the Liberal Party, they are still puzzling over where they went wrong. They thought they had a successful administration in the previous government, and they tend to blame things on fake news. What's your take on that?
Sounds common.
No, I think it's more than just fake news. I think the Liberal Party had a difficulty communicating what they were doing to the people. They had a difficulty connecting to people. I mean, Benigno Aquino's charisma is really transferred twice, from his father's death to his mother to him. And he himself is not a naturally charismatic person. And really, they have to admit that they were slow. They did not look at the people, the insecurity of people's lives. I don't think they had a good sense of that. And Duterte had. You know, how insecure people were because they were vulnerable to crime, to losing their jobs, to a lot of uncertainties as being part of the global economy. I don't think they addressed that enough. Many of them were well-meaning, but I think at one point they also became a little bit alienated and somewhat arrogant. Yeah.
We'll take one more because then otherwise we're impinging on your coffee break, and I know what happens to a Harvard crowd when we don't leave them fully caffeinated. It's ugly. Anybody else out here? Was there another hand back here before?
I think is there someone at the back? Yes. Yeah.
You had a better angle on them than I did. There we go.
I wanted to ask, when we're talking about popular, people who are plutocrats, what's your take on the state of, if they're to be challenged, grassroots politics at the local government level or some other such thing, how do you see that playing out in the Philippines?
At the local government level?
Yeah, so that potentially a grassroots thing could eventually develop as a possible better alternative.
I mean, in fairness, Filipinos have been trying to do that, to build grassroots democracy for a long, long time. But the problem is how the grassroots democracy coalesce, and really at the local level where political office is still dominated by powerful families that have had a monopoly of public office, like in the Aquino case, for example, for 100 years. It is very hard to assert grassroots democracy against patronage politics and against, in many cases, also violence, because many of these families are armed. So it's an uphill struggle, but that doesn't mean we should stop trying.
Well, Sheila, I can't thank you enough. This has been a fabulous conversation and a lot of fun. Thanks so much.